Hey, welcome everybody. Today is November 16th, 2022, another Wednesday webinar, and thanks everybody for joining me. First thing I wanted to say, I did want to get to some the question and answer as promised today, but I had a few things as usual I thought of last night that I thought would be good to go over first. We also got a lot of comments about the gain of fiction piece from last time. So I thought I would try to just to clarify that a little bit. And by the way, next week we will post an interview, a short interview I did with Mike Stone from Viroli OG, who did a piece on gain of fiction, which I think everybody should read. And we go over, in particularly, the recent Boston University, or somewhere in Boston, I'm not sure if it was Boston University, study that has got everybody all excited about a new Omicron type of variant, which is another piece of pure fiction. And we go over the study so you can see that for yourself. The main thing I wanted to point out is my beef with all this is very simple. There is no virus, never has been. There are not viruses that cause disease. Viruses aren't pathogen. There's nothing that's, viruses are not contagious. These illnesses are not contagious. SARS-CoV-2 doesn't exist, so it cannot be a gain of function virus because it simply has never been shown to exist in reality. And if words mean anything, which I contend that they do, any lawsuit, anything that attempts to show that this virus was created by gain of function research is simply anti-scientific nonsense. Now, that's not to say that there aren't labs doing things. By the way, this also means that any attempt to investigate patents is basically is futile and a waste of time and a waste of money. Because if they're not, anybody can patent just about any fictional thing or anything you propose to make. And to say that that proves that something was done or something was real is simply not true. So the whole pandemic story based on a gain of function virus as proven by the patents is simply not reality. So it isn't that, and the third thing, by the way, is also therefore a focused attempt to put the so-called perpetrators of this gain of function research like Fauci and Ralph Baric, I also think is a waste of time and will get us nowhere, because it isn't that these are wonderful people who we should all support, but getting rid of them will do most of us, I'd say pretty much all of us, no good at all. There'll just be somebody else who does the same thing. And it just makes you feel like you've done something when in reality, nothing has happened. The only thing that's going to change this narrative is when we all realize that virology research does not deserve to be funded in any way. And the vast majority of what's called medical and scientific research doesn't need to be funded in any way because it's basically bogus. And we don't need to focus on individuals who are doing this because it's the whole system that's doing this. Once we understand the biological realities, starting with the fact that there's no virus and there's nothing contagious, and then moving on to the whole realm of ribosomes and DNA and synapses and the whole genetic paradigm and evolution and all the rest of it, we will start to create a living biology that actually serves people. So that's the agenda that I want to promote. And this vindictive going after individuals will get us nowhere. And not only that, it'll never happen. They won't end up in jail. And it just serves, like I said, the narrative, which is we should all be scared, and then eventually we should all turn this over to the World Health Organization because they're the only grown-ups in the room who can be responsible for overseeing medical research. And that, as I said, is a sucker play. And so we shouldn't fall into that. And that was my basic point of this Gain of Fiction piece I did last week. The only other thing I wanted to say about this, which is a little bit of an update on our viral challenge, which is slowly moving into the phase where we can entertain connections or an actual agreements with private labs or labs that might be willing to carry out our experiments. So we're trying to finalize the draft agreement so we can make a legally valid and enforceable contract with them so we can get the experiments done exactly in the way that we want. And whenever somebody is thinking, and a lot of people who are still, quote, sitting on the fence, they don't know whether who to believe in this sort of freedom community, whether there's the no virus camp or the engineered virus or one of the other ones. And what I proposed last time is just imagine or put yourself in the situation where the main complaint, and this has been complained by a lot of people, is that the powers that be, the Fauci gang and all the rest of them, they don't do real science and they don't tell us the science, and they don't base their decisions and the masks and the mandates and the so-called vaccines, injections, they don't base it on real science. And so that's our basic complaint, and we don't know how we've gotten into becoming such a anti-scientific society. And then those same people, and we've pretty much asked all of them, every single prominent member in the scientific medical community who still believes in some version of the virus and engineered virus, and essentially what happened is I decided to throw them a lifeline to say more and more people are not believing your story here, who are catching on that the only real issue here is whether viruses actually exist at all. More and more people are demanding that that position be looked at. So when I threw them a lifeline, meaning I said, you don't have to decide, you don't have to conclude that you know what the answer is. All you have to conclude or decide is that you want to have the real science done. And so here is a way to do the real science. Here is a perfectly valid and doable experiments that any virology labs could do. Blinded, it will give us a first step in understanding whether the methods used by virology are real or not. And since your main complaint is the mainstream narrative doesn't follow the science, why would anybody interested in finding out the truth not want to do this? And all we've heard is a resounding, we don't want to do this. We don't want to support this. We've never once heard, oh, but here are already those studies have been done. Here they are. You don't need to do these studies anymore. They've already been done. We've not once heard that. We've not been presented with one scientific paper that has done the studies that we suggest, which would validate the methods of virology. Nor have we heard even once from any member of the so-called freedom community who believes in viruses. Not once have we heard, well, why don't you do this experiment in addition, or change it to this, or you could modify it in this way. We are very open and willing to improve our experimental design to make it even more clear and to possibly add other control experiments. But not once have we heard from anybody, here's the better way to do it, here's a better experiment, here's what would make it even more valid. All we hear is, we're not interested in doing this, this is divisive. Now, ironically, in a sense, that's exactly what Fauci says. Oh, we don't need to do those kind of science experiments. That would divide the population, and it would make people angry with each other because they would have to suspend doing things right now and wait for real studies. And so we can't do that. It's too divisive. So exactly then, apparently they think Fauci was right and that we don't need to do real scientific experiments. They don't need to present us with here are those studies which have actually been done. Never do we hear that. Or here are improvements of those studies, or more controls, or a better way to validate it. We never hear that. Instead, we just hear, we don't want to do this, it's too divisive, as if the issue of whether there's a virus is not the key to unraveling this whole mess. So let me move on then to another thing, which I think I've touched on this before, which is, what do you want to know from your doctor, if you still have a doctor, which already is a kind of dicey proposition, but to a certain extent, we all need at some point in our lives to have some kind of contact with the medical establishment, or at least we think we do. And I hear about this a lot, and there is a way of thinking about this, which I would say, what do you actually want to know about your situation from your doctor if you still go to one? And this also gets into the whole concept of surrogate tests, because the general theme I want to bring up right now is the fact that you never want to base your decisions on what medical procedures you're going to do on a surrogate test unless you're absolutely sure that the surrogate test is relevant to what you're trying to accomplish. So what do I mean by that? So if you go to a cardiologist, for example, I hear this a lot. I've heard it probably hundreds, if not thousands of times in my medical practice. And you go to the cardiologist and he does some tests and he says, you have high cholesterol, and so you need to take a statin drug or eat a no-fat diet or something like that, take red yeast rice or something therapeutically so-called to lower your cholesterol. Now, the principle I want to suggest is that the only valid question that you want to know from your doctor or from any medical scientist or medical person is, will this intervention you're suggesting improve the quality and quantity of my life? In other words, will I live longer and will I live better? I would suggest that if you ask the doctor, can you show me a study that clearly proves that lowering cholesterol results in a longer and better quality life, He will, A, not be able to come up with that study because I'm sure it does not exist. And B, he will probably get angry at you and maybe even threaten to dismiss you from his practice for having the gall to ask him such a question. And I want you to think about that for a minute, because first of all, why isn't it your right, since it's your body and your health, to ask a simple question like, does that test actually predict the quantity and quality of my life? And will your intervention actually increase the quantity and quality of my life? What could possibly be wrong with asking that question? But instead, you'll get a lot of surrogate questions or surrogate information. And even you have to be very careful about what might be surrogate information. He could say, well, statin drugs lower your rate of heart attacks, which I actually highly doubt if there's any study that shows that. And of course, you could think, well, I don't want to have a heart attack. That's a horrible thing to have, et cetera. But I would also submit that that isn't exactly what you want to know. It's close. I don't want to have a heart attack. I don't think anybody wants to. But it doesn't necessarily mean that whether or not you have a heart attack will improve the quality and quantity of your life. It could be, but you cannot make that assumption unless you can point to some evidence that those who have heart attacks have a shorter and less quality of life Because it could be, if you have a small heart attack, for instance, that gets you to change how you live and how you move and how you eat. And it could be that people who have small heart attacks, for instance, that don't kill them, actually go on to have a better life. It may be a kind of wake-up call. My point is, I don't know if that's true, but it's certainly something that I would want to validate with a proper study. And this comes up even more particularly with in cancer medicine, because the oncologists and surgeons are always giving people, instead of asking the question or answering the question, will this intervention you're going to do, like surgery to remove the tumor, or chemotherapy to shrink the tumor, or radiation to shrink the tumor? And they usually say, if you do this therapy, the tumor will shrink. Now, I would submit that shrinkage of the tumor is a surrogate marker that doesn't necessarily mean you will live longer or live better. So it's obvious, for instance, you can take any tumor in your intestine or on your skin, and you can use high-dose radiation, and that tumor will probably shrink and maybe even disintegrate. But the person may die much sooner with a lot of symptoms and a lot of trouble and a lot of pain and a lot of misery than if they had simply done nothing. So you don't want to know whether you get fewer recurrences. Again, you can take somebody with a colon cancer and bombard them with toxic chemotherapy, and they may get fewer metastases in their liver or in their lymph nodes or in other places. But that's not the same as proving that they will live longer and live better. In fact, they may die of something else because of the effects of chemo, even if they don't have a metastases. So it got to the point with me that the only information, the only studies that I would actually trust are, can you show me that this test you're doing correlates with people living longer and living better? And this therapy that you're proposing, whether it's surgery or chemo or pharmaceutical drugs, or even diet, or even strophanthus, nobody should be afraid, except those who are afraid of the truth, of finding out what happens when we do whatever intervention it is. Nobody should be afraid of finding that out. And the only ones that I ended up trusting were, can you demonstrate that whatever intervention, whatever test, A, correlates with how long and how well I live, and that this therapy will improve those things. And there is no reason, especially if you're talking about cardiology and oncology and MS and Parkinson's and all the different serious diseases, strokes that we face. Why would you not be allowed to ask that question? Doctor, can you show me a study that shows that this intervention improves the quantity and quality of my life? And if they won't show it to you, you've got to ask yourself and probably them, why can't you show us this? Now, I will also admit that it's very difficult to do these kind of proper studies, even to the point of you have to wonder about certain interventions, like certain interventions I can imagine only work with the cooperation of the consciousness of the person. In other words, if you do tuning forks or something with the person, or have them move in certain ways, you cannot double blind that, because part of the therapeutic effect has to do with the cooperation and, in fact, even the enthusiasm of the patient, of the person doing it. And I would say that, in fact, most good natural medicines have something to do with the person deciding, based on their information that they've received and talking to other people, that this whatever, herb, diet, exercise, tuning forks, whatever it is, this will actually improve my life. And I think that's actually part of the therapy. And so even as time went on, I started trusting even double-blind studies less and less, and relying mostly on people's experience. In other words, I would say, what did you do and what happened to you? Well, I took chlorine dioxide or whatever, and my melanoma shrank, and 10 people say that, and then I start taking notice. That's obviously not proof, but I start taking notice that somehow this intersection of chlorine dioxide and your understanding that this might help you resulted in these people in a better quality and quantity of life. And so I would encourage people to really think about how these things get proven, and to stop believing in these so-called surrogate markers, that these tests that they always tell you, oh, your SED rate went down, or this marker went down, or your cholesterol, your LDL. You don't want to know that. You want to know, how am I doing, and will this intervention actually improve my life? And there's no reason why you shouldn't demand and get those answers, or be told we simply don't have that information, which is a whole different kettle of fish. Okay. I had one more thing, another thing. This comes up a lot with vaccines. They say, oh, well, you give this chickenpox vaccine and you'll get less chickenpox. But again, I don't think that's what you want to know, because it could be, and I think it actually is, that children who get chickenpox actually go on to have fewer chronic diseases than children who don't. It just goes to show, my point is that you have to be very careful about what information you're getting, because even something like, well, you'll see less chickenpox or less measles, but that could be only because you've switched a harmless acute detoxification phenomena, and now the children have more asthma and eczema and all kinds of psychological, quote, problems and cancer and all the rest of it, because you poisoned them worse and they can't go through this harmless detox. In other words, You don't want to know whether people get less chicken pox. You want to know, will my child be healthier, happier, live longer, and live better with or without that so-called vaccine? That's the only thing you want to know. You don't want to know about how many people get skin rash or chicken pox or measles or any of those things. That's not relevant. It's show me that people live longer, live better with or without this. And if you can't do that, why not? Because that's the only thing that really matters. I also wanted to point out that this way of thinking, which is trying to get at the heart of the matter, and I realize I'm probably going longer and I'll try to still get to questions here, but I think hopefully this is important and people are interested. Actually is not confined only to the medical profession. I think this is something that we have to start getting used to thinking about in all areas of life: government, economics, politics, schooling, etc. You know, with schooling, it's not, has my child learned to read in first grade this number of words? But is my child healthier, happier, and ends up being a more whole, healthy human being as a result of this process or as a result of this other process we call school? You don't want to use a surrogate marker of who can read this flashcard by age 9 or do this arithmetic problem by age 8. That's not what you want to know. You want to know, is my child thriving, happy, healthy, given this conditions versus that conditions? In other words, keep your eye on the target.